I have worn a whole bunch of different hats over my years in the business. I started out mostly working in radio news at WBZ in Boston, did some TV news back here at home in Rochester, New York, went back into public radio for 20 years at WXXI here in Rochester. But along the way, I also kind of became that tower site guy. So I have visited thousands of broadcast facilities around the country. I've written about them for publications, including Radio World and for my own Northeast Radio Watch and Tower Site of the Week over more than 30 years. And in more recent years, I have been doing a lot of FCC consulting. I do a lot of FCC application work. I do some consulting engineering here around Rochester for several locally owned station groups. And lately, I've been doing some station brokerage also, and actually helping people buy and sell radio stations. So it gives me the opportunity to see a whole bunch of different pieces of the industry, primarily on the radio side, but we'll touch a little on video, excuse me, too, because everything at, excuse me, at this point has become so overlapping between radio and video and digital. So let's see if we can get the screen share going here. Hopefully that will work. You guys able to see that okay?
Yep.
All righty. So we will start that going. Is that full screen for you now?
Yeah, but we're seeing everything of yours and not just one slide.
Should not be doing that.
Slide.
There we go. How about now? All righty. So this was my 23rd NAB show. I started going in 2001, mostly writing for Radio World at the time when I was there. And these days I cover a lot of ground and a lot of different pieces, not just of NAB, but of the shows that preceded as well. So the first thing that is notable when you go to NAB these days, I guess I can't get a visual show of hands, but at least maybe by voice, how many people have been out to Vegas, at least in some fairly recent years, to go to NAB?
Nobody
Not
raised
many?
their. So we need this.
So things keep changing physically at the Vegas Convention Center. This was the view last year of the North Hall, which traditionally has usually been where most of the radio vendors have been. And they have been in the midst of some massive renovation at the convention center in recent years. And so it went over the course of a year from this in April of 24 to this in April of 2025. So they are really working pretty massively right now um, to finish up the renovation of the North Hall, which is reopened. And then the next phase for next year is going to be reopening the Central Hall, which was closed under renovation this year. Which means in turn that a lot of the vendors for both radio and TV are now going to be sharing space next year in the newly renovated Central Hall, which will be a little bit of a change from what we've gotten used to. This is the new West Hall, which opened a few years ago. And at least this year, this is where just about everything that wasn't just vendor floor was located. And so all of the SBE's broadcast engineering sessions were being held here. Before the formal NAB show started, the Public Media Venture Group did a public TV engineering session that replaced the old and now defunct PBS TechCon. That was held here. All sorts of press conferences were going on here. The media room was here. I found it to be a pretty convenient location, and in no small part because you can park near here. And there's also a really excellent bagel shop right next door called Siegel's Bagel Mania. There's just an easy walk right out of the side of the West Hall. So that will change again next year, and we'll get used to it because we always do. Here are a couple of shots. This is looking down at the South Hall. South, at least in the last few years, has been where a lot of the big video vendors have been, and those typically have these massive booths that take up tens of thousands of square feet. So that's Panasonic there. Here's another view looking over at Blackmagic and at Avid. You can see Chiron off in the distance there. Ross is just over to the left. I think these guys may also be moving mostly to Central Hall next year. I'm not sure. As is typical with NAB, you can't possibly see everything in the course of a few days. And so these are actually pictures that were taken by a colleague of mine from WXXI in Rochester, who was doing a lot more video stuff, and he made it down to that end and got to see a little bit more of it, honestly, than I managed to. This is, that got a little bit loud there. There's always kind of some eye candy. This was from AT&T. I'm not sure what the purpose of putting a video camera on a robot dog was, but they put a video camera on a robot dog and everybody took pictures of it. But getting back to the stuff that I was focused on, there are kind of a core group of primarily radio vendors that I spend a lot of time with when I'm there trying to figure out what I can bring back to my clients and tell them about, and also what I can bring back to do these SBE chapter talks and tell you about. One of the things that I noticed as I was talking with a lot of these vendors this year is that, you look around obviously for the things that are particularly shiny and new, and there wasn't a lot of that this year. And I mentioned that to a couple of colleagues, and they said, yeah, that's true. But the people who are making the things that work are making them work even better. And so that was sort of part of the theme that I took away from NAB this year, was that if you are there and you are serious about really looking for stuff that has been perfected and is more than just vaporware, because there's always a lot of vaporware on these show floors. There was a lot there that was not only functional, but has kind of been refined. And the other thing that's really noticeable are the price points on a lot of this, because obviously you can go to a lot of these big vendors in any given category, and you can find plenty of stuff that they will gladly sell you that will go into the 5 or 6 figures or more if you are outfitting a major broadcast facility. But in recent years, there's been this trend too, where this sort of not even prosumer, I mean, this is basically professional gear that is available now at high 3 or low 4 figure price tags. And you see this in both radio and in video and TV. And so, here's Blackmagic Design giving you what is basically a fairly fully functional TV switcher. And I believe their price tag on this thing is barely into 4 figures, if I'm not mistaken. And so you can afford to outfit a pretty inexpensive studio with this. And honestly, if it breaks, you buy another one and replace it. Again, assuming that tariffs allow you to do that economically. That was another big story of NAB this year, obviously, because a lot of this news about tariffs was hitting just as we were there. That first big crash in the stock market was taking place the first few days of NAB. And because it has become a little bit more difficult for international travelers, attendance was significantly down this year. We've been accustomed, anybody who was there pre-pandemic saw stated attendance figures from NAB that were over 100,000 people. I think it peaked in 2018 or 2019 at about 108,000 registered attendees. The number they claimed for this year was 55,000. And I think a lot of them may not even have shown up. I know there were some issues with some vendors being able to get some of their people through customs and some of their stuff through customs to display. And it's still a lot of uncertainty in the industry because, of course, nothing much is manufactured here. And even the stuff that's manufactured here is manufactured from raw materials that come in from elsewhere and are tariffed. And so this remains a great source of uncertainty as we head into the next few years as to how some of these vendors are gonna make their way through this. But let's forge ahead and look at what was actually on the floor. So, this is Blackmagic Design, and if you've been outfitting any kind of video facility, they do these switchers. They are doing incredibly inexpensive cameras now. They are doing all kinds of little monitors and recorders and converters. And there's stuff like this over on the audio side too that has been a game changer. Anybody who has had to build an inexpensive radio or audio studio facility in the last few years, you have some choices that just didn't exist a few years ago. So you can go with any of the big vendors, like the Wheatstones or the Axias or the SASs. But nowadays, you also have the option of spending literally $700 and getting these little Rodecasters that will do most of what these boards will do and can interface with a phone through Bluetooth to play audio and to take calls. They can generate their own mix minuses. You can generate streaming feeds from them. And again, it's a disposable, basically $700 unit. And so the big guys know now that they have to be able to compete with this. And so at the very low end, for instance, from Wheatstone, this was some of what we saw on the floor from them, and they will still gladly sell you, their $15,000 network consoles. But they will also sell you these new Audio Arts consoles. The one on the left here is a digital console. The one on the right is just a purely analog console. I think it's 8 channels of audio. It's a little bit more than a Rodecaster. It costs a little bit more. It's $2,000. But it's also going to give you a little bit more professional look. It's going to work a little bit better, have a little bit more radio functionality. And that unit on the right there, somebody actually came at the end of the show, laid down $2,000 bills on the table and walked off with the display unit because they had an immediate need. So clearly they're doing a little bit of business with that. But we are at the era we're the era now where you don't even necessarily need a physical console for a lot of what you're doing with this. And so again, for example, this is SAS's version of a completely virtual console. This will interface with anything that they have networked, and they're networking. They're primarily Dante based, but they will connect with other networking systems. They can connect with Axia through Livewire. You can connect them with existing Wheatstone blades if you need to. And now all of a sudden, if you no longer have an actual physical studio, if you have talent that's working mostly from home, if you're having a show that maybe only needs to be local in the morning, you don't necessarily need to build a studio with a board. You can set up a large monitor and you can put up a touch screen or you can use a mouse and you can customize this to do absolutely anything you need to do. Again, any of the vendors now have versions of this, excuse me, that you can customize to make work with their systems. Wheatstone has their Glass E. Axia has their version of it. Some of the European vendors have their versions of these. So I presented this in particular at the SBE chapter in Syracuse a couple of weeks after NAB and was talking with one of my particularly insightful friends. And he raised his hand in the middle of this presentation. He said, "You know what?" I said, "Tell me." He said, "If I am in the process of trying to figure out a facility, unless I have to build it right now with what's available right now, I'm waiting another 3 years because if I wait another 3 years, his take is that it's not just this that is becoming virtual. All of the different pieces that go into making a radio facility for the most part, beyond the microphone and the speakers and the transmitter, are all converging into one sort of virtualized, containerized radio facility. And so his take is that in a few years, these vendors will be working together. So you will not only get this console system, but it will work with an automation system. It will work with a virtualized audio processing system. One of the things he's working on also is EAS, because anybody who has dealt with EAS knows that one of the two major hardware vendors, that being Sage, has just pulled out of the hardware business. And so all of a sudden, you can no longer buy a blue box from Sage for your EAS. You have to either find one that's still in stock at a vendor if they still have them, find one used, or go down the road from me and get a DAS deck instead. Well, that's obviously not sustainable long term. And there were meetings going on at fairly high levels involving FEMA and the NAB and the vendors to figure out just how quickly EAS for both radio and TV can become a software function. And once it becomes a software function, where does it live? It could live right in your transmitter. It could live in your audio processor. It could live in your automation. It could live in your console system. And ultimately, it will live in some combination, perhaps, of all of these. And we're moving towards that pretty fast, which makes it an exciting time. If you're like me and you have a station owner who's saying, I want to rebuild my studio now, and I'm kind of holding them off and saying, well, we'll get there. Let's see what's coming up. As I mentioned, we're seeing the same thing happening with automation. So this is a mostly virtualized version of wide orbit automation. Again, most of the major vendors, whether it's RCS, Wide Orbit, ENCO, any of the European vendors, will now sell you something like this that no longer needs to live on a physical machine at your facility. You can put it in the cloud, which means now you don't even necessarily have to have a studio. I'm doing some work with one of the European vendors that works with a lot of English radio stations, or I should say UK radio stations, that have mostly gotten rid of their local facilities. And so a lot of English radio now, the national brands are all run out of London. And so your KISS FM station, wherever you're listening to it, probably has most of its programming coming from London if you have a local morning show, and that may be all that you have that's left locally. They can connect to one of these virtualized systems, run their morning show from whatever tiny little studio is left in Manchester or Bristol or Hull or whatever smaller English city they're in. And then it just throws all the way over to London and it runs out of the cloud or out of a main studio in London. Again, these things are all converging very rapidly with automation, with audio processing, with music logging. And there is a convergence coming of some sort that is making it very different from the facilities that we're all used to, where it's a whole bunch of boxes that each do their own individual thing, that each take up space in a rack room. And we've got to learn to get ready for that because it's coming. Everything is getting smaller and more compact. This is a TV transmitter in a box. So I noticed this one at the Gates Air booth. This is, I believe, a 100-watt analog, 70-watt digital TV transmitter. And so if you have a translator somewhere, if you have an on-channel booster somewhere, and you don't want to have to deal with American Tower or Crown Castle or whoever you're dealing with, and paying them a lot of ground rent to put a bunch of stuff in a rack inside of a building, they'll sell you this box. And this box sits on the tower, and RF goes up to the antenna, an internet connection comes into it, and power comes into it, and it just sits there and does its thing. And I asked them, okay, if you can do this for low power TV, at what point are you going to be ready to do this for low power FM? And the answer is that it's probably coming pretty soon. And so there are a lot of possibilities for this. If you have a little LP-FM station that only needs to put out 100 watts and doesn't necessarily need to sit on the ground anywhere, they will eventually have one of these that has built-in processing. So again, you supply it with an internet feed to get audio, and you supply it with power, and you run it up to an antenna, and it sits there and does its thing. The other potential application for this that I think we're going to see a lot more of are these on-channel booster systems for HD FM radio. And these can be used if you're just doing a little fill-in somewhere that only needs to inject 10 or 15 or 80 watts into a small area to fill in a little reception hole, especially in the kind of terrain that you're dealing with in a place like Portland. You could stick one of these up on a telephone pole. You could stick one of these up on a roof. And again, you're not dealing with ground rent, with having to maintain a whole bunch of stuff in a rack. It is also a single point of failure, so there is that to consider. And especially in areas that get warmer, you have to deal with cooling. It has cooling fins on it. In areas that get rough weather, it's designed to protect against rough weather. But again, this is kind of where we're going. That box over to the left there is the even newer version of their FM transmitter. I think that's a 500-watt transmitter. in just a couple of rack units, so it's half the size of the 500 that I just put in for a client here. As long as you have the cooling to handle it, that stuff is taking up a lot less space too. One of the really neat things that happens at NAB, and one of the reasons that I like to go, is that you just never know who's going to be there to answer which questions. And so I've been learning about ATSC3 and what it can do for TV, including some of these little fill-in boosters that can go on channel and can fill in reception holes. And I decided it was probably time for me to get myself an ATSC3 3 tuner because I didn't have one yet. So right before NAB, I ordered one of these little Zapper box units and had it shipped to my hotel in Vegas. And I'm playing with it and I'm tuning in the ATSC3 signals in Vegas. And I'm realizing there's some stuff I don't know how to do in the box. And I mentioned that to a friend of mine who I saw on the floor, who I knew was running an ATSC3 signal in Vegas. He said, "Oh, you want to meet the CEO of the company and ask him?" I'm like, yeah. And so he took me back to this booth in the back of the West Hall where a bunch of ATSC3 vendors were all displaying their stuff. And there was the CEO of the company. And in about 5 minutes, he walked me through the menus on the box and explained how to do the thing that I couldn't figure out how to do. Long and the short of it is, I'm now a beta tester for them. And whenever they have a software release, I'm going to end up being their willing victim to see how it works for me. But again, those are the sorts of reasons that I like going to NAB, is that you have a chance to ask these questions very directly to the people who can actually give you very direct answers to them. This also, by the way, is a good display of some of what they're doing that's going to be direct to consumer. Some of these boxes are going to be available for as little as 70 to 80 bucks, and in volume, hopefully less than that, tariffs willing. And the neat thing about that is that eventually we're going to need them, because one of the conversations at NAB was about the transition from our current ATSC1 system over to ATSC3. There is a proposal on the floor right now through the FCC that would cause that to happen as early as 2028 for larger markets like Portland, and then 2030 for all the smaller markets that are left. There is a sense that that's still a little bit premature. There are a lot of smaller markets that still don't even have ATSC3 up and running. And so that will probably get pulled back a couple of years. But that's something that's on the table too, is to do yet one more conversion of our TV system and take it over to ATSC3. The good news is with 3, it's a lot more robust for areas of weak reception. It puts up with terrain better. You can do a lot of these on-channel boosters a lot better. And so for a lot of these areas where people have struggled with over-the-air TV reception, ultimately it may help them in the long run. We shall see. One of the other huge topics, and here we kind of get away from gear and over to regulation. Delete, delete, delete. This was the actual title of the rulemaking proceeding that the FCC dropped on the entire broadcasting industry just a couple of weeks before the NAB show opened. And we have a new FCC chairman, of course, in the form of Brendan Carr, who had been a minority commissioner as a Republican. He's now the chair. We're seeing a turnover among some of the other members of the commission. We did not see very many commissioners at NAB this year, in part because government travel funds were frozen. And so 2 of them came, or actually, I should say, one of them came on her own dime and appeared. One of the Republicans who was supposed to show decided not to travel at the last minute, and so his was canceled. The one Democrat who showed up really couldn't say a lot because she's not in control now of a lot of what's happening. But right after the convention, the FCC released the many thousands of filings that came in. And it's interesting what Brendan Carr did, because we know some of the things that he wants to see happen. He has been very clear about it. We know that he wants to loosen ownership restrictions and allow companies to own a larger share of radio and TV licenses in any given market and remove national caps on that. We know that he wants to remove a lot of the remaining restrictions on broadcast content. We know that he wants to ease the FCC's regulatory burden on broadcasters, but what they did was they put out this omnibus request that said anything within our rules, we're open to comment on whether or not we should revise it or get rid of it. Well, surprise, surprise, surprise. everybody with an axe to grind decided to file comments. And so you had a lot of comments on things like ownership caps, on things like content rules. But then you also had, and I know I heard some ham radio discussion going on in the chat at lunch there before things started. So you had a huge set of filings that came from the ham radio community with various proposals that they want to ease some of the restrictions on various spectrum usage policies and on various licensing policies. I don't think that's an FCC priority, but hopefully that'll at least get looked at. You had what I will charitably refer to as the 5G loonies chiming in from underneath their tinfoil hats, trying to make sure that they got heard on whatever conspiracy theories they have about how their brains are being rotted by whatever we're all doing in the communications world. And so the FCC now has something like 6,000 of these comments, plus reply comments that are due in a couple of weeks, all to go through. And so I think they bit off a little more than they can chew. We shall see what comes of that. This is actually, I'll go back one slide first also, because I should mention in particular with this ownership issue. So as I mentioned, one of the other hats that I wear is as a broadcast station broker. And we have a breakfast every year of the remaining broadcast station brokers. There are only a couple dozen of us who are left now in the business. But we get together and we talk about the state of the industry. And we also usually hear from our DC attorney. And traditionally, he will show up just to give us a quick overview of what's happening in the regulatory world. And he'll give us what's generally a very bland look at, okay, this rule might get altered slightly. This rule is probably unlikely to change. He showed up this year, threw up his hands, and said, you guys, I have no idea what to expect. We just don't know. Everything is changing so quickly at the FCC, including potentially with FCC staff, that we don't even know who we're going to be dealing with a year from now. So if a lot of us who deal with the commission are taking some extra Zantac and Prilosec for the next year, there is a good reason why. One of the upbeat parts of the convention, there was a pretty large broadcast educational component to it. And every year, the Broadcast Educators Association brings both educators and a bunch of their students. And so this was a session that I wish had been a little bit better attended. This was, I think, on the Tuesday of the conference, upstairs in the West Hall. And it was an opportunity for some of these broadcast educators to tell the rest of us what they're doing with their students and what we all should know about what this next generation needs from us. And I think it's especially important, kind of hearing the roll call of you guys and a lot of you being retired. There is definitely a brain drain in this field. One of the reasons why I got into contract engineering here in Rochester is that there was just nobody else around to do it, and there were people who needed the services that I could offer. So the guy on the left there is my friend Andy Gladding. Andy also wears a bunch of hats. He is the chief engineer for Salem Media in New York City. He and his wife just bought a radio station up in the Hudson Valley, about an hour and a half north of New York. But in this context, he is also in charge of the education program at Hofstra University on Long Island. And it is a phenomenal program that he runs there. Because as he explained, he brings kids in and he makes sure that they learn how to get their hands on stuff, how to break it, and then how to fix it once they've broken it. And what he does there is turning out kids who can then go from this program where they're not only learning engineering, they are learning broadcast production, they're learning music, they're learning news, they're learning sports. The college has had the contract for a number of years to produce New York Islanders radio broadcasts. And so the students are right in there actually running the boards and doing the promos and doing the pre and post game shows and sending it out to a network and getting all of this experience that lands them actual jobs in New York City and Philadelphia and at ESPN in Connecticut because they've had this experience coming out of NAB, which is phenomenal. And we need to do more of that. And I'm not sure how much of this there is in the Pacific Northwest. I know there was one educator there who was from one of the Cal State campuses up in Northern California, so I'm assuming that overlaps at least a little bit into Southern Oregon. But they also mentioned the question came up, okay, how many students collectively out of the three of your programs who are talking, how many of those students are going to be graduating over the next 4 years? They've got 1,000 kids coming out of these programs. Do we have 1,000 jobs in radio that are ready for them? Maybe not. And so it's kind of incumbent on the industry if we want to continue to have people coming in to listen to them about giving them opportunities. Quick plug for my podcast, Top of the Tower. The episode that's dropping later tonight has both Andy and his colleague there from New Paltz, New York, appearing in there, answering some of those very questions. So that should be a good listen. I encourage you to give that a listen. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts. Earlier, before NAB itself started, one of the other conferences that I really love is the Public Radio Engineering Conference, which traditionally takes place over at the Tuscany. It's two phenomenal, really deep dive days into a lot of radio technology, but also a little overlap into video because there always is. This is my colleague Rob Bertrand presenting, and Rob was fascinating. He was actually on my podcast last week. He just lost his job last year at the NPR station in DC, went off on his own very briefly, and then signed up with another company out of Chicago that essentially provides broadcast engineering as a service. And his take on this is that we need to be thinking about that more too going forward because, and here's one of his slides, there are a lot of things that a lot of stations, and this is looking primarily at public radio, but applies to commercial too, we can't do everything at the local level anymore at a lot of these radio stations where we just don't have enough of a full-time engineering staff. And so we get locked into these individual ways of doing things that don't give us the opportunity to pick up skills that we're only going to need occasionally, whether it's putting in a brand new music scheduling system, whether it's switching over to a brand new automation system, putting in a brand new networking system. You only have to do these things a couple of times, perhaps. In a career at a small station, you're not going to have those skills necessarily in-house. And so his take is that it's important to have services like the company that he's got, which is Inrush out of Chicago, where again, he's trying to hire younger engineers and to teach them to be, if I can borrow the iHeart phrase for this, tiger teams that can have some of these specialties and that can come in when they're needed and be available to work with small and medium-sized and even sometimes larger stations to provide these kinds of things as services in the same way that we're already accustomed to, at least in public media, things like uh, membership services. Most public stations outsource those. Most public stations outsource the way that they handle some of their back-end giving so that they're not dealing directly with credit cards. Why not perhaps think about outsourcing some of these things for an engineering skill set too? And so he thinks that creates a virtuous circle that allows things to become more scalable and frees up resources to do a lot of the things that you could do best locally, like providing the kind of content the public broadcasters are still trying to do as they're dealing with all of their issues with funding too. If anybody wants any of these slides, just drop me a line at scott@fybush.com, and I'm happy to send those along. I have the audio of Rob's talk too. It was really worth listening to. And again, it's some of the really great insight that you get out at NAB. This was the paper of the year at NAB. Remember, I mentioned my friend Alan, who had that insight about virtualization. He also has been working very closely with Xperi over the last couple of years on some of these on-channel boosters for FM HD radio. And this was a project that he did over the last couple of years, working with iHeart in Atlanta. So iHeart in Atlanta has two extremely good full market Class C FMs. And then they have a bunch of lousy rim shotters that really try to serve Atlanta, but they're over on one or the other side of the market, don't serve it fully. And on top of that, Atlanta is kind of like Portland in that the main broadcast facilities for FM are right there close to the center of the market and create a lot of receiver overload when you're trying to get any rim shots. They've tried on-channel boosters, just analog or hybrid analog and HD. Question that came up was, what if we tried to do this and made these boosters HD only? They tried it. And they found in their case it worked particularly well, much better than the hybrid boosters. And so they were able to add literally a couple million people to the number of people who driving around on these highways in Atlanta. And you know, in Atlanta, if you've ever been there, that you're spending a lot of time sitting parked on highways in cars that hopefully now have HD radios in them. These on-channel HD boosters were able to overcome a lot of the noise and provide useful signals on this rim shot. Again, if you're interested in a copy of this paper, my friend Alan would be happy to provide it. So it was another interesting piece, and I was very happy that he got Paper of the Year for that one. He really deserved it. There's also just always some fun stuff. Here's our friend Bob Orban. He presented at both the SBE conference and also at PREC because it was the 50th year of Orban. And so he talked a lot about the very earliest versions of what became the Optimod when he was still mostly working in music production and recording in Northern California rather. And so that is the prehistory of the Optimod, his overload prevention system from 1972. And on the show floor, he had this amazing collection of a lot of very rare historical Optimods that all, by the way, work really well. And people were bringing, they showed up with doors off of their 8100s and 8000s. We're having him sign them on the show floor. So it's always kind of neat to celebrate some of that legacy too. Interestingly, by the way, here, as far as processing goes, we have suddenly, just in the last year or two, moved away from the big glitzy on-screen displays of all of the top-end processors and gone back to doing it mostly through GUIs and much more modest displays. And so the stuff that's state of the art now are things like the Optimod 5950, which is basically one rack unit and nowhere near as glitzy as the 8700i that I have at my station. But it's interesting that we've kind of moved away from that. Um, and again, this is something else. Ultimately, will it be a hardware box in another few years? Probably not. We shall see. So I got to have a little fun in Vegas too, and I'll finish off just with a little bit of the fun of going to Vegas. My sister and her friend were out there this year. They dragged me out to see Barry Manilow. Um, he's 81. He still sounds pretty good. I think there's been a lot of renovation going on his face, but he still put on his show and did Copacabana and the outfit there. I also I did not pick up the Barry Manilow I Quack the Song's Duck. I kind of regret that now, maybe next year. I also for years have been dying to go see the Sphere. And so this was the view. I went up to some transmitter sites, of course, while I was there. And this is the view from Black Mountain up above Henderson, up past the airport, looking down on the Vegas Strip with a lot of the newer landmarks that you see now. So on the left, you can see the kind of blue circle there. That's the high roller, the kind of Ferris wheel thing that you go up in pods. And then in the middle is the Sphere, and over on the right is the enormous video screens on Resort World, all of which you can see from many miles away. But I have not been inside the Sphere until this year. We went to see the Eagles. That's my sister and her friend and me after the Eagles. And it is just an absolutely mind-blowing experience. I thought, oh, I've been to an IMAX theater. I have a sense of what this is going to be like. It is not just an enlarged IMAX theater. The thing seats, I think, about 12,000 people. It's in a whole set of very steeply tiered seating. If you're afraid of heights, I don't recommend sitting in the upper decks. This is the show they put on for about an hour after they let you in while you're waiting for the show to start. And it just very imperceptibly keeps getting darker for the hour before the show starts as you're sitting there looking at this super high-res view of all of these LA landmarks that are all animated. This shows you a little bit of what the seating is like. So unless you are doing what I'm doing and craning your head way straight back to see the back of the theater, you are completely surrounded by the visuals. You're surrounded by the audio too. There are something like 156,000 individual transducers in the seats, behind the screens, up above you, down below you, that just give you absolutely incredible pinpoint audio. So it's not just a visual experience, it's an audio experience too. It's not just the screen. So here you get a sense of how far up I am from the stage. For a live band, you kind of maybe want to be a little bit lower to really see the Eagles. But here you can see how they're using part of the screen, but then the dot pitch on those LEDs is actually really wide. They can turn them off. They can use the lighting and the framework behind them and create visuals that way too. That actually is Glenn Fry's son, Deacon. They brought him in because Glenn Fry is not with us anymore. He was fantastic. And here's just kind of a sense of what they can do. I'll pause this for a second before I start it. So just kind of a sense of the huge visual impact of this. This is the song "In the City," if you're familiar with it from the Eagles. This started out with just a very small animation of 2 or 3 story buildings going on behind them, and it kept growing and growing and growing, and kept rising up the sphere behind them. And watch also what they do with mixing live video in with this pre-produced animation rather. I mean, the amount of work that's going on behind the scenes to make all this happen in real time is just phenomenal. So I'll show you what this looks like. So you're seeing live video there on stage of Joe Walsh, who, by the way, as I think most of you know, is also a ham radio operator and has worked with Heil microphones a lot in the past. But you're seeing Joe up there on screen. There were points where they were doing a film strip presentation and mixing in vintage pictures of Eagles from the 70s with live video of each of them on stage. Absolutely mind-blowing. They have actually a mini sphere. If you ever go near the Burbank Airport, there is a mini sphere where they do a lot of the pre-production for a lot of this and test out a lot of the effects. And I'd love to get behind the scenes on this and see it because it was just mind-blowing. So that's that there. Let me, there we go. And just a couple notes on food because I always like to get some food in there when I'm in Vegas and I don't get the lunch that you're all getting today. This is an awesome barbecue place. All the best places to eat in Vegas are in really sleazy looking strip malls away from the strip. So this is a really good barbecue place where a lot of people ended up. I think if you were over at the Wheatstone House this year, they were getting catering from them. But they do in fact like their pig butts and they cannot lie. And then this was the Netflix pop-up that was over at MGM called Netflix Bites, where everything was themed based on Netflix shows. And so I think the theme was better than the food on that one, but it's always a fun night out in Vegas. So that concludes my presentation. That is where you can find me if you're interested in finding me. There's a lot of stuff at my website at fybush.com. What there is not is a lot of updated photos of Portland and the Pacific Northwest. And I'm overdue to come out and visit you guys again in the near future and get some updates because it has been way too long.
Before I forget, let's thank Doug Tharp at SCMS for lunch.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was a really good, smooth presentation. I appreciate this.
My pleasure. I'm glad it went better than Seattle yesterday, which hopefully we can find a chance to reschedule for them because I'd obviously still like to present for them. But we are on to Eugene and Medford tomorrow and Friday.